Description: Mr. Door. This naming style is very similar to mine. I wonder what was the real name of this pathetic fellow who was lost and trapped in the deep darkness amidst the storms is, and what his sequence is. Or rather, just as Emperor Roselle had guessed, he's one of the evil gods or devils. Klein let out a silent chuckle which was mixed with ridicule and self-deprecating humor. He was also interested in the history of the Fourth Epoch. He know of the most famous War of the Four Emperors in the Fourth Epoch, but the specific details and the main figures involved are limited to the information spread by the major churches. For example, the Dark Emperor of the Solomon Empire. It wasn't until today that this so-called Mr. Door finally answered my questions by letting me know who the remaining three emperors are. The half-insane Blood Emperor of the Tudor dynasty, the Night Emperor of the Trunsost Empire, and the Emperor of the Underworld of the Southern Continent, also known as Death. According to Mr. Door's description, in this war that changed the situation of the entire world, the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor, and Night Emperor fell one after another. The Emperor of the Underworld reaped the greatest benefits. Having said that, Mr. Door added with profound significance that after over a century of digestion, Death went mad, but he also became stronger. Therefore, Death teamed up with the primordial demoness and brought about a pale disaster for the northern continent. Of course, this isn't something he witnessed personally, but rather something that he hears when he comes close to the real world every month. Death went mad but also became stronger. Even deities can go mad. What a horrifying sentence. However, this also confirms my guess. Before the Fifth Epoch, those deities would often descend into the real world, directly interfering with the situation in the northern and southern continents. They might even personally appear just like Death. T asked Mr. Door if he had participated in the War of the Four Emperors. If so, what role did he play? And what was the position the seven deities maintained in this war? What role did they play? Mr. Door didn't answer my question. He only said in a teasing manner that the number of preeminent mighty figures in the Fourth Epoch far exceeds my imagination. In addition, he also mentioned two laws. One is the law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility, and the other is the law of similar sequence Beyonder characteristics conservation, which is consistent with certain things that I have learned from that most secret and ancient organization, and also from some of the phenomena I have observed. This can lead to many interesting conclusions, making many explanations take on other forms, making one's mind tremble in horror. For example, when there are too many high-sequence Beyonders in the same sequence pathway, the low-sequence Beyonders would reduce, and vice versa. The Beyonder characteristics have been fixed at the source. It will not increase or decrease. Does this mean that there really is a God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God, and everything originated from it? This was the longest Roselle diary that Klein had ever seen. It took up 2 full pages, and one could imagine that it originally came on a double-sided page. It only became 2 separate pages after repeated copying. That's a lot of information, Klein sighed silently. As a history student who had graduated normally, he had always believed that the Solomon Empire, the Tudor dynasty, and the Trunsost Empire came one after the other in a line, with a certain degree of restoration before a new political outcome was established. To his surprise, the War of the Four Emperors described by Mr. Door clearly and unambiguously revealed one thing: all 3 empires had existed at the same time. If this were true, then it would really overturn most of the current research on the Fourth Epoch in the field of history. Klein suddenly thought of the original Klein, who was filled with interest towards archaeology and the history regarding the Fourth Epoch. Today, I've helped him achieve his wish. I wonder if Death had already become a true deity during the War of the Four Emperors. It's hard to determine according to Mr. Door's descriptions. I can only first assume that the Emperor of the Underworld, who had obtained benefits from the War of the Four Emperors, had broken through his limits and become a deity, but he also went mad as a result. To have a deity go mad was truly terrifying. Just thinking about the details makes one tremble from the bottom of their heart. It's no wonder that the knowledgeable Emperor Roselle would use the word horrifying to describe this matter. Could it be that the so-called evil gods were crazy orthodox deities? Would that mean that there might only be evil gods left in this world one day? Man, does this mean that the end of days cannot be stopped? Klein smiled to hide the growing solemnity of his emotion. He felt that the future he imagined was filled with a dark gray hue. At the same time, He raised his evaluation of the Dark Emperor, Blood Emperor, and Night Emperor, believing them to be the preeminent mighty figures who were close to being deities. Perhaps that means sequence 1 is the peak existence of a single pathway. According to this logic, for Dark Emperor to live for centuries or over a millennium wouldn't be unacceptable. That would explain the original Klein's confusion. He had obtained contradictory findings from the content recorded in the Antigonus family's notebook, with his own mentor's viewpoint. He believed that the Dark Emperor was the common name used by every emperor of the Solomon Empire. Perhaps, the Dark Emperor had always been the same Dark Emperor. Of course, other possibilities cannot be eliminated. For example, they could have been replaced 2 or 3 times, but is the name of that pathway's sequence 1, Dark Emperor? I wonder who Mr. Dor is in the history of the Fourth Epoch. Emperor Roselle didn't go into detail when describing his erroneous experiments and accidental coincidences, making it impossible for me to even try to converse with that Mr. Dor. The laws of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility and similar sequence Beyonder characteristics conservation shares the same description as the one used by the captain. Perhaps the term he used came from Emperor Roselle. According to the 2 laws described by Mr. Gate, we can indeed deduce a lot of interesting speculation. For example, with there being so many holy artifacts and high-sequence Beyonders in the 7 churches, there shouldn't be many low-sequence Beyonders. But this contradicts reality, and the only reasonable explanation is an additional gift from the deity. For example, is the destruction of the nation of the Evernite due to the conservation of characteristics, that the mere possession of resources causes it to be in trouble? Or could it be said that their existence seriously weakens the potency of the Evernite pathway and threatens the position of the goddess? For example, theoretically speaking, certain sealed artifacts could also be used as the main ingredients for potion materials, or they can even be considered equivalent to potion. Of course, the prerequisite is to remove all latent dangers and madness. No wonder the documents that were unearthed called the Fourth Epoch, the Epoch of the Gods. So it turns out that in this epoch, there are many records of deities descending. Then what caused them to stop coming, to the point of there not being any revelation? If it wasn't for the fact that Beyonders receive responses from ritualistic magic, perhaps many of them would have doubted the existence of the deities. Many ideas came to Klein suddenly, as he felt that he had delved deeper into the realm of mysticism in this Beyonder world. He flipped through the next 4 pages, and was disappointed to realize that they were no longer related to Mr. Dor. His ability as a clown allowed him to conceal his emotions well, and coupled with the gray fog's obstruction, even Audrey, who was secretly observing him, didn't notice anything amiss. He gathered his chaotic thoughts and started reading the 3rd page of the diary, 10th September. I've endured it for a long time, but I still can't help but complain a little. He must have had F-King SAT for brains to chose the savant path, right? Of course, this has indeed allowed me to develop my greatest advantage, allowing the church to attach great importance to me. But the problem is that the first few sequences lack any Beyonder powers needed for combat. I can only make do by relying on mystical items, and rely way too much on external items. For example, sequence 9, Savant only has extraordinary abilities in memory, learning, and practical skill. For example, sequence 8 Archaeologist gains a strong physique and corresponding ancient knowledge, and they can only barely apply some ritualistic magic. For example, sequence 7 Appraiser, whose ability is to quickly identify mystical objects, allowing them to avoid hidden dangers to the greatest extent. For example, sequence 6 Artisan, who can produce machinery wonder but not very powerful Beyonder objects. Apart from that, one's standard in ritualistic magic will be enhanced. It's no wonder its modern name is Machinery Specialist. Comparatively speaking, the sequence 7 Warlock and sequence 6 Scrolls Professor of the Mystery Prior Pathway are sufficiently tempting. It would be great if only the church has the complete sequence, and that the hidden sage doesn't exist. However, I finally received some good news. After I advance again, I'll gain Beyonder powers combat powers that I can call my own. Sequence 5 Astromancer. Its modern name scares me a little. It's actually called Astronomer. Am I going to end up as an all-powerful mad scientist? Heavens have mercy on me. I was only a second-tier student at the college entrance examination. It had to be said that Emperor Roselle had a strange talent for making jokes. Even the recently dispirited Klein couldn't help but twitch his mouth, wishing to light a candle for this senior. Study hard and improve by the day is indeed a wise saying. He lampooned and remembered the unique trait of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. They lacked Beyonder powers when it came to combat, but they were good at making and using items. After flipping to the third page of the diary, Klein continued reading. 2nd June, the kingdom has created chaos, again and again, instigating wars without being able to completely destroy the Fasek Empire, the Lone Kingdom, and the Fainapotter Kingdom. As such, the kingdom has no choice but to shoulder huge debts, and its economy is on the verge of collapse. From my observations, the people, merchants, and soldiers are very dissatisfied. The riots are just lacking a spark. This is my chance. But I have to be very careful. The Sauron family has witnessed the history of the Fourth Epoch, and is an ancient family with a high possibility of having high-sequence Beyonder. I need the support of the Church, as well as gain a tacit agreement with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. He can appear immediately. First, Peel let the rebels destroy order before I end it all as a protector. Consul Roselle Gustev. I like that name. Knowledge June 3rd. After discussing with Edwards and the others, I gave up on the idea of reaching a tacit understanding with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. This might very well reveal my true intentions, making the Sauron family and the ancient nobles who support them aware of them in advance and carry out a direct approach. That would make matters extremely difficult and dangerous. Tt's a pity that Grimm died in the Sea of Fog. He was the smartest among us. Descend into chaos. Descend. Only with everything in chaos will I get the chance to fish in troubled water. Only when the Sauron family is incapable of handling this situation will the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun reluctantly acknowledge me. Perhaps I should give some help to those rebels, but how should I conceal myself so that no one would notice? June 4th, Zaratal from the Secret Order came to visit me in incognito very suddenly. And then, Klein was just feeling intrigued over the reason why Zaratal, leader of the Secret Order, would seek Roselle on the eve of the rebellion and coup d'etat, when he realized that the 2 subsequent pages had nothing to do with it. This made him feel a sense of irrepressible anger. Although the 3 diary pages didn't provide very detailed descriptions, with rather straightforward accounts from Roselle, Klein could still feel the famous turmoil in Intis that happened in 1173, more than 100 years ago. The outcome was clearly recorded in history textbooks. As a colonel, Republic quashed the rebellion and enacted political changes. The Intis kingdom was transformed into a republic, with him acting as a self-appointed consul. In the following 19 years, he reformed the penal code, encouraged inventions, and protected the Industrial Revolution. He greatly increased the country's strength and fought wars both north and south, making Lemberg, Masson, Seger, and other countries protectorates under the Intis Republic. He also made the 3 mighty countries on the northern continent, the Fasek Empire, the Lone Kingdom, and the Fainapotter Kingdom, bow their heads. At the end of 1192, almost 20 years after his appointment as consul, Roselle converted the Republic into an empire, declaring himself Caesar. Less than 6 years later, he perished in the White Maple Palace, ending the Fifth Epoch's most legendary piece of history to date. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that there was more to Roselle's death than what appeared on the surface. It was just like how this famous historical event definitely had power struggles amongst Beyonders behind it, and that a Beyonder faction had leveled the situation, unlike the descriptions in textbooks. As expected, one of the so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, Grimm, died in the Sea of Fog. In a previous diary page, Roselle had written that there was something wrong with this horseman. It seems to have something to do with the tiny island where they discovered many extraordinary beings. Not only was it a fortuitous encounter, but it was also a dangerous one. Klein thought of a previous entry and turned to the 5th page, feeling emotional. The contents of this page are of little value. They consist of Roselle's comments after drinking an 1128 Almir red wine, the disillusion of finding the woman who had gained his adoration in his youth to be aged and out of shape, as well as a degenerate summary of a certain period when he was addicted to playing cards. The 6th page was about the same as the first one, with accounts of his daily life. However, the last one made Klein's eyes light up. 8th April, I have to send someone to investigate the Secret Order to get more information. I can't repeat my passiveness from before. I can't let Zaratal lead me by the nose anymore. So did you discover anything, Comrade Roselle? Since Klein couldn't find the rest of the information, He could only force himself to calm down and wait for the next gathering when the hanged man would hand over another 6 pages. He knew that an investigation from over 100 years ago was unlikely to help him find any clues related to the secret order association. After all, over such a long period of time, other than the special ones, many of the high-sequence Beyonders would have already died of old age, not to mention the middle or low-level members. However, Klein believed that this would help him obtain inspiration and grasp the precise identity and activity patterns that the secret order often used. Putting down the 6 diary pages, Klein tapped his right index finger on the edge of the long bronze table, slowly moving his gaze from Miss Justice to the hanged man, and then to the sun. Right in the diary just now, there was a line Emperor Roselle described. God who created all the deities, an omnipotent and omniscient God. This is very similar to the customs of the City of Silver. Where did he hear this from? Could it be from that most ancient and secret organization, which controls the world from behind the scenes? This organization was established before the forsaken land of the gods was forsaken. Suddenly, Klein had a new idea. He said with a low and gentle smile, Roselle mentioned some hidden history in his diary and mentioned some simple general knowledge. The latter reminded me of something that I don't recall informing you all. Audrey suddenly fell into a trance. She immediately turned her body around and looked at the very top of the ancient long table in pleasant surprise. Mr. Fool is taking the initiative to mention the contents of Roselle's diary. What would it say? She was so excited and thrilled that she completely forgot that she was a spectator. Compared to her, the hanged man Alger was much more composed. However, the subconscious straightening of his back heartlessly betrayed him. Only the son, Derek, had always believed that the items of interest to Mr. Fool contained many mysteries, but he didn't know anything about Emperor Roselle and didn't know what this name represented in the northern continent. Thus, he just found it difficult to hide his curiosity and didn't reveal any unusual behavior. Mr. Fool, did Emperor Roselle mention some general knowledge? I'm willing to pay for this information, Audrey couldn't help but say. However, I want it to be communicated to me privately. She added silently in her heart. Klein chuckled and said, there's no need. This is very simple general knowledge. After reading this part of the diary, as the summoner of the Tarot Club, I feel it's necessary to let all of you know this. Of course, I'm very certain that some of you are already aware of this. He was mainly referring to the sun. The City of Silver had a history of 2,000 to 3,000 years, so it was impossible for them to not discover the law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. Moreover, they were in a relatively extreme environment. Even if the surrounding areas had no lack of monsters in the darkness, there would still be times when they failed to obtain the corresponding material. In order to pass on their heritage, in order for their city to continue on, using the Beyonder characteristics of the remains of their predecessors to create a potion wasn't particularly unacceptable. To them, this was perhaps a sacred and glorious ceremony. Of course, Klein could see from a previous exchange that the hanged man knew something. It's a pity that Miss Justice cannot always be made to pay in gold pounds and transfer the money to my adorer. My adorer can't appear any less impressive. I mustn't destroy the image of the powerful man that Mr. Azek has created. Yes, I'll give it a try when I have the chance. After all, no matter how powerful a being is, they'll have subordinates that run errands. For instance, the Evernight goddess is sleepless. No one would ever suspect that the Evernight goddess isn't a true deity just because the low-level Nighthawks are weak. Klein sighed silently. Thank you very much. Mr. Fool, you are just too generous. Audrey replied in joy. She was originally feeling 3 seconds of regret for the coarse action of using cash to purchase the information. Klein stopped rapping the table and described with a calm voice, the first piece of general knowledge, law of Beyonder characteristics indestructibility. The characteristics of a Beyonder is never destroyed or reduced. It's only passed from one carrier to the next. Without realizing it, I use Captain's tone. Klein's lips subconsciously curled upwards. It cannot be destroyed or reduced. It just transfers from one carrier to another. Audrey ruminated over Mr. Fool's description, feeling that there was too much meaning in that simple sentence. Her emerald green eyes turned, and when she saw that neither the hanged man nor the sun showed any signs of surprise or contemplation, she immediately understood that these 2 members of the Tarot Club had long known of this law. Only I didn't know, she thought, feeling somewhat aggrieved, but she quickly began to praise Mr. Fool for his kindness. At this point, Klein added, After a rampager dies, they will leave behind an item of Beyonder characteristics. It could be the main ingredient, or it could be a mystical artifact that requires sealing. Ordinary Beyonder's death results in similar results. However, the item left behind will be equivalent to the corresponding potion, without the supplementary ingredients. Of course, the item alone will contain Beyonder power. They can be used as a half-mystical object. The plain and indifferent words instantly echoed in Audrey's mind. Layers stacked upon layers, and bit by bit, it eventually reached a crescendo. Audrey thought of cannibalism and the question, would a sequence pathway be severed if the source of Beyonder materials ceased to exist? She had asked the hanged man previously came to mind. Now she knew the answer, but she would have rather not heard it. She felt like she was having a nightmare. How can it be so cruel? Why is it so dark? Audrey had previously seen some bad situations that involved Beyonders, but those situations were only caused by a person's own perverse and evil nature. For example, Mr. A or Kalangos. They didn't affect her yearning and love for mysticism and the Beyonder world. However, this time, she discovered that the mystical world was filled with grayness and darkness. Wake up, Audrey, you can't be naive. Consider that the cruelty and darkness described by Mr. Fool are predictable. Since he had chosen this path, he had to bravely walk down it. Audrey consoled herself, easing her mood a little. She saw that the hanged man and the sun were making only habitual movements and appeared to understand what had just been said. HMPH. Mr. Hanged Man is terrible. He even wanted to use this information as an exchange previously. This information is indeed worth a lot and is quite important, but it's only a simple piece of general knowledge to us and Mr. Fool. Audrey suddenly wanted to laugh a little. Her mood began to improve, and she slowly pushed all the extreme examples that she had just thought of aside. Klein wasn't surprised by the three members' reaction. He continued in a calm tone. The second piece of general knowledge, law of similar sequence Beyonder characteristics conservation. Law of similar sequence Beyonder characteristics conservation. The hanged man slightly changed his sitting posture. He felt that he understood something, but he was unable to fully understand what this law represented and what it consisted of. Justice and the Sun shared the same feelings as he did. They were unable to directly understand the true meaning behind this law. Why similar sequence? Alger couldn't help asking. Klein smiled and replied, what do you wish to pay for the answer? One of the ideas he had was that general knowledge was free, but any explanation required a fee. This both matched his status and didn't waste the information. Free things cost the most. If the fool had simply mentioned that there was some simple general knowledge contained in Roselle's diary, the hanged man, Alger, wouldn't necessarily be determined to pay the price for the answer, partly because the description of it being simple killed his curiosity. Another aspect stemmed from his constant wariness against making trades with the fool, as it reminded him of the examples when deals were made with evil gods and devils. But now that he knew the so-called contents of simple general knowledge, his interest was piqued. Yet he was unable to understand parts of the description, much less gain any actual or deep grasp of the concept. Therefore, he couldn't hold back his urges to ask in absolute reverence, Mr. Fool, what kind of payment do you want? Yes. Justice Audrey nodded her head nearly indiscernibly, but very frequently, indicating that this was something she wanted to ask as well. Although the son Derek remained silent and didn't make any additional body gestures, the look he gave to the fool explained everything. Klein, who was waiting for such a response, smiled and said, information regarding the secret order. The secret order, the hanged man Alger muttered to himself. He wasn't unfamiliar with this term. He had once received payment for explaining to Miss Justice about many secret organizations, including the secret order. Audrey and Derek both frowned subconsciously. The former's only understanding of the secret order was limited to what the hanged man had described, and the latter had never even heard of such an organization. Klein had long anticipated what the son would feel, but he wasn't surprised. According to his conjecture, the area where the City of Silver was located should have been a part of the third epoch after the appearance of the first blasphemy slate and before the appearance of the second blasphemy slate. It was even possible that it was the direct catalyst or manifestation of the cataclysm. The Zeratul family had only stepped onto the stage of history in the fourth epoch, and the secret order was created in the latter half of the fourth epoch. There was no way both entities could have existed in the same period. It would surprise Klein if the Sun were to know about the secret order. He would then have to overturn some of his speculations, reconstruct his knowledge of the City of Silver, the forsaken land of the gods, and the Zeratul family. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, Alger looked at the fool in the gray fog, deliberated his words and said, "I will accept this request and help you gather information regarding the secret order. Can you make payment in advance?" It wasn't surprising that a suspected deity was interested in an ancient and secret organization. Therefore, Alger wasn't puzzled about it. More importantly, after many gatherings, he had a guess in his mind, which was that Mr. Fool's state wasn't perfect, that he might be in a predicament, that all his attempts and the actions of his adorers on the northern and southern continents were to help him break free from his confine. This might even be related to the huge secret of why the 7 deities no longer descend upon the real world after the 4th epoch. A thought flashed through Alger's mind, and he shuddered as he felt himself entering the realm of the gods. Upon hearing the hanged man's request, Klein leaned back in his chair and nodded. "No problem. If the information you have collected exceeds the value of the answer, I will provide you with further compensation. As for the circumstances in which the value of the answer was lacking, it is naturally up to the esteemed Mr. Fool to decide. If he has the ability to make the additional payment, so be it. If not, forget it," Klein silently added. Just as Audrey's eyes lit up all of a sudden. She raised her hand and said, "I want to partake in this deal." Klein laughed and replied, "Sure." Frankly speaking, his main target was Miss Justice, because she was a local of Backland, and she had mixed herself into several Beyonder circles. Her access to information in the Land of Hope far exceeded his, considering it was his first time in the capital. She was also more informed than the hanged man, who was out at sea most of the time. According to the earlier revelation he received from his divination, Klein believed that the clues related to the secret order would appear in Backland, and not anywhere else. The son Derek listened quietly and after some thought said, "I'm willing to use the payment I reserved and exchange it for the answer." In the previous 3-way deal, he had traded the Sequence 8 telepathist formula for Sequence 9 bar. Klein had promised to compensate him, and his choice at the time had been to save it up and prepare for the subsequent potion formulas and main ingredients. Klein nodded his head and gave an explanation that he had long prepared. The so-called similar sequence refers to how high-sequence Beyonders are exchangeable with other pathways. Let me give an example. The Death Pathway Sequence 5 Gatekeeper can not only be advanced normally, but one can also choose the Giant Pathway, which is the Gatekeeper Pathway Sequence 4 Demon Hunter. This won't lead to the danger of losing control, nor will it accumulate madness. It's different from taking the wrong potion. Of course, if it's not a similar sequence, a semi-deranged state is the best result. Exchangeable. Audrey blurted out, surprised and delighted. She was surprised that sequence pathways weren't completely fixed, that they didn't need to follow the original path all the way. The price of switching wasn't being semi-deranged, and never to advance again. Within the 22 divine pathways, there were special circumstances and sequences which were similar. And what delighted her was that she had another chance to choose again in the future. It was just like being able to select something that caught her interest at Philip's department store. It was a wonderful experience. "So that's how it is," Alger silently muttered to himself, suddenly feeling like he had understood several things at once, and he had resolved many of the doubts accumulated in his past experiences. This information is way too valuable. As expected of Mr. Fool, so-called simple general knowledge is enough to shock and almost low-sequence Beyonders and benefit them immensely. He sighed inwardly. Derek the son was a little disappointed, because he had no intention of changing sequences. He wanted to be the sun that lit up the darkness and dispelled the curse. However, he quickly recalled an incident that happened in the City of Silver. The former chief, a powerhouse who had the greatest possibility of breaking past the limitations of Demon Hunter, had built a mausoleum for himself and went deep inside, making it his home. Afterwards, he appeared less and less, until the main door of the mausoleum could no longer be opened. Back then, the citizens of the City of Silver all believed that a problem had arisen during the chief's advancement, and that he had gone mad, to the point of being close to losing control. He was believed to have finished himself off. Now, combined with the description from the fool, the son suddenly thought of another possibility. That chief might have been attempting to advance in sequence through a similar pathway. In one of his explorations deep into the darkness, he had acquired the corresponding formula for the death pathway, and the mausoleum might have been a special requirement, but in the end, he still failed. But why didn't he turn into a monster? What did he encounter in that dark mausoleum? The City of Silver doesn't have the subsequent sequence potion formulas after Demon Hunter. As these thoughts crossed his mind, Derek was suddenly jolted back to his senses by Miss Justice's reserved voice. "Mr. Fool, may I ask what other pathways are exchangeable with the Spectator Sequencer pathway?" "Sequence 4 Demon Hunter sounds pretty good. That's very suitable for me, very suitable for Justice." Audrey admired the first high-sequence name that she knew. "I want to know too." Klein was tempted to answer Miss Justice's question in such a manner. Before he could say anything, Audrey added in a faltering tone, I can pay for the answer to this question." How many gold pounds do you think is enough?" I believe that your adorer will need a certain amount of funds for their activities." Having said that, she recalled how Mr. Fool's adorer had easily finished Pirate Admiral Kalangos, who possessed creeping hunger. Clearly he was a high-sequence Beyonder, so she nearly said, "I apologize. Mr. Fool, treat it as though I never said a thing." However, since she had already asked, she couldn't back down. "Come on, Audrey. Perhaps the Fool has a weaker adorer." Audrey quietly bit at her lips, silently encouraging herself. "Gold pounds." Klein thought about it seriously and said, "We'll make the transaction after enough information about the secret order is gathered." As he spoke, he recalled his informant in the Psychology Alchemists, Daxter Guderian. "Captain and I sigh. Daxter's identity as an informant can no longer be verified. I wonder if it's a tragedy or a comedy. It's a pity that I can no longer contact him anymore. Otherwise, it would be the most convenient way to obtain the information regarding the spectator pathway from him." Klein smirked. "All right," Audrey answered happily. The conversation between the two made the hanged man, who was about to ask a similar question, shut his mouth. He left it until he had gathered enough information on the secret order. After a brief silence, Audrey turned her head to look at Mr. Fool and raised her hand very slightly. After receiving a nod of confirmation, she turned to the member opposite her and asked with a sense of anticipation, "Mr. Hanged Man, my tip allowed you to finish Rear Admiral Hurricane. Have you prepared the complete pituitary gland of a mature rainbow salamander?" "That's one of the reasons why I returned to the sea." Alger nodded gently and said, "I've gotten the Beyonder material you want. But how should I give it to you?" How should it be given to me?" Audrey froze for a moment as she lost herself in thought. "It's impossible to just give my address, nor can I go through Zeo and 4. That will reveal the fact that I'm a Beyonder whom. It's not impossible. Emperor Roselle once said that, when we should choose the lesser of two evils at that moment." Klein's heart stirred. He lightly tapped the edge of the long table and smiled. "Miss Sir, are you willing to cooperate with me in making an attempt regarding this matter?" Trial attempt. Justice was instantly thrilled as she nodded her, acting reserved and elegant. Team very willing to cooperate. As a spectator, she clearly remembered that Mr. Fool had only used the word attempt on two things. The first time involved bringing her and the hanged man into this mysterious space, and the second time was when they were given an honorary name so that they could attempt to make a prayer. And the outcome was sufficiently successful, revealing his true nature. What would it be this time? It really is something to look forward to. Audrey restrained her impatience and tried her best to behave as a qualified spectator. Tempt Alger suddenly tensed up, viewing the fool's proposal with utmost wariness. What does he want to do? What is his true purpose? Is this good or bad for me? One by one, thoughts popped up in his mind. The rapidly rotting appearance of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalango surfaced in Alger's mind. Finally, he lowered his head and respectfully replied, "Your wish is my wish." Beside him, Derek looked at the hanged man, and then at Justice, wondering why they were so sensitive to this so-called attempt. Klein lightly tapped his fingers on the edge of the long bronze table and smiled. "This attempt will make your transaction easier and safer, and it will definitely be sufficiently confidential." He turned his head to the side and looked at the hanged man. He said with a moderate pace, "Do you remember the sacrificial ritual described by the sun?" Klein had deliberately mentioned it to show how open he was. It made it difficult for the members of the Tarot Club to imagine that the sacrificial ceremony he was about to provide had actually first been obtained from the sun, and that he had gone through all that time an effort back then to trick the son out of a template sacrificial ritual. Remember, I do come into contact with such things usually, Alger answered truthfully, but his heart was throbbing. Since the Orthodox gods rarely responded to similar rituals, the word sacrifice had often been equated to evil gods and devils in the fifth epoch. Thinking about how this could lead to a terrifying outcome, the hanged man felt as if he was walking at the edge of the abyss. If he wasn't careful, he would fall in, only to be eroded and devoured. Klein followed his plans and didn't provide further explanation. He nodded slightly and said, "My idea is for you to sacrifice the Beyonder material to me through the ritual, and I'll bestow them to Miss Justice. A transaction like this will be beneficial for both of you." "That can be done." Audrey was instantly dumbfounded. She felt that this exceeded the limits of her imagination. But she very quickly came to her senses and understood the advantages of this method and the true nature of a deity hidden behind this simple act. "Mr. Fool is great. As expected, our tarot club will be different from the other secret organization. We'll use the method of deities to exchange for material goods and ingredients." Audrey almost said praise the lady in her mind out of habit, but in the end she said, "Praise Mr. Fool instead." Alger turned even warier as he entered a state of calm thoughts. "Honorable Mr. Fool, what do I need to do?" He tried to figure out the true purpose of the fool from the process of the sacrificial ritual. Klein lightly pressed his right hand and said, "Like I said, this is only an attempt. It might not succeed, so it will need your cooperation. First of all, prepare an altar. There's no need to make it too complicated. It can be very simple and crude. The only requirement is to engrave or draw this symbol." As he spoke, a screen of light appeared in front of him. On it was the symbol of the hidden, pupilless eye, and the mysterious symbol of the partial contorted lines, the same symbol on the back of the fool's chair. After previous experiments without using materials with spirituality, Klein was certain that the sacrificial ceremony he designed could create an illusory gate above the gray fog, similar to the door of summon. However, his strength alone couldn't construct a stable channel, and he could only use the uniqueness of the mysterious space above the gray fog to complete the sacrifice. Therefore, he was 90% confident that the ceremony would be successful. The only problem was if an ordinary passageway could be constructed using ordinary materials that contained spirituality, or did it need to be Beyonder materials as well as a sufficient number of them? "I'll let Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man bear the cost of this experiment. In any case, they knew from the very beginning that the Tarot Club was a product of an attempt. It can be foreseen that there would be other attempts subsequently, and failure is inevitable. Even deities are no exception." Klein decided to transfer the cost. As the Hanged Man, Justice, and the Sun were attempting to memorize the symbol, Klein chuckled. "If you forget, you can pray to me, and then you can remember." "All right," Audrey answered happily. "With Mr. Fool, rituals aren't tedious and troublesome," she thought happily. The Hanged Man nodded in response as Klein continued the description. "Secondly, follow the normal procedure, but there's no need to burn any more additional herbs or apply the holy oil. There's no restriction on time, just chanting my name is enough. Remember, use ancient Hermes or Jotun to recite this piece of prayer. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take his offering. Pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom. After you finish chanting, combine the materials that contain spirituality with the natural power created by the incantation, and await my response. If you don't succeed in this step, change from materials containing spirituality to Beyonder materials, and try again from the beginning." After listening quietly to the procedure, Alger felt that his previous guess was very likely to be the truth. The fool was in a predicament. He offered alluring attempts, making attempts one step at a time, and planned to use himself, Justice, and the Sun to slowly break free of the restriction. In the end, he might even descend into the real world. This was also the true reason why he had initially pulled people into this mysterious space, agreeing to the establishment of the Tarot Club. Even without this previous speculation, Alger believed that he would have come to the same conclusion after hearing of the experimental procedures required after the sacrificial ritual, and comparing it with the fool's previous attempts. The only thing that stumped him was the possession of a powerful adorer. Therefore, there was no need for him to use himself, Justice, and the Sun. His adorer could make similar attempts. There must be secrets I don't know about yet. The attempts need to be sufficiently secretive. And perhaps his adorer is being watched by certain existences. Alger began connecting the dots. After Klein finished describing the ritual, he asked in a low but gentle voice, "The sacrificial ritual needs a specific time. Mr. Hanged Man, when do you plan on making the attempt?" This was different from responding to a request, which could have a delayed response. The stable passage created by the sacrificial ritual could only exist for a very short period of time, so Klein had to wait above the gray fog ahead of time. The rainbow salamander's pituitary gland is the only Beyonder material I have with me for the time being. As for materials with spirituality, I do have quite a lot, Mr. Fool. Once the gathering ends, Peel immediately attempt the first scenario. If it fails, PLL seek out other Beyonder material. Once I obtain anything, I'll inform you by praying to confirm a time, Alger said, as he couldn't help but turn his gaze towards Miss Justice. As a spectator, Audrey instantly understood what he meant. She answered without the slightest hesitation, "If any additional Beyonder materials are required, I'll compensate you afterward." "Well, I can't guarantee the specific type of material you would want." As expected of the wealthy Miss Justice, the fool Klein couldn't help but sigh before chuckling. "We have come to an agreement." He looked at Justice and said after some thought, "Once Mr. Hanged Man's attempt succeeds, I'll inform you of the bestowment ceremony." "All right." Audrey was entirely confident with Mr. Fool's ability. After answering the question, a sudden thought struck her as she realized that the exchange of money could also be done through this method. Of course, this was only if the attempt was a success. "I wonder if items without any spirituality would work or not," PLL asked Mr. Fool again after the attempt is successful. Audrey's lips curled as she thought of the beautiful future. With the sacrifice and bestowment topic coming to an end, she deliberated for a few seconds before saying, "Mr. Fool, I've found two ladies suitable for our tarot club. They're both Beyonders and have their own circle and resources in back. They're also able to keep a secret and have decent personality. Are you willing to let them join the gathering? Does Justice want to strengthen her faction within the tarot club?" This was the most instinctual thought that Alger had. Derek was very interested in this matter as he looked sideways at Mr. Fool, waiting for his answer in anticipation. Klein appeared to be in a bit of a dilemma. Previously, he had imagined that the members of the tarot club wouldn't know each other, and they would then develop their own subordinates, forming a relatively tight and secretive organization. This way, even if a certain member was exposed, captured, or had their spirit channeled, it wouldn't have much of an impact on the tarot club. But Miss Justice's description just happened to hit his weak spot. He was hoping to find clues regarding the secret order and Lanvis by acquainting himself with Beyonders with different circles and resources in back. If it's done through Justice, the person involved would eventually hold back, however. I'm not sure if it's possible to pull them up above the gray fog simply by reciting my name, in order to maintain his image. Klein didn't think too much and instead procrastinated on it. He said calmly, "It will require a certain amount of examination. Miss Justice, use a clandestine method that wouldn't expose yourself to let them know of my name to garner interest in them." When Audrey saw that her proposal was about to be accepted, she immediately responded in excitement, "Yes, Mr. Fool." After a few more exchanges, the gathering came to an end. The Sun, the Hanged Man, and Justice returned, while Klein remained in the gray fog, waiting for the sacrifice. A higher level, the Blue Avenger was like a leaf on the surface of the undulating waves of the Sanya Sea. At times it was raised high and sometimes low from the ebbing of the waves, but there was no sign of it being at risk of capsizing. Alger Wilson stood in the captain cabin, his back to the shelves of red and white wine, as he subconsciously paced around. Finally, he gritted his teeth and returned to the mahogany desk with a grim expression. He removed the brass sextant, found a piece of paper and a pen, and leaned over to draw the complex, mysterious symbol given to him by the fool. With a seafarer's memory, Alger quickly completed the first step of the sacrificial ritual. Then he opened the drawer and took out a candle. He set up the ritual according to the dualism principles, and placed a candle above the symbol that was formed by the combination of the pupilless eye and the partial contorted line. One candle was placed in the middle that represented the person making the sacrifice. After cleaning up all the items on the table, Alger condensed pure water in the palm of his hand and wiped the altar clean. He then used the silver dagger from the ceremony to create a sealing wall that surrounded his desk. After doing all this, He used his spirituality to light up the two candles and retreated a few steps under the dim light. Taking a deep breath, Alger lowered his head and recited in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. You are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. T pray for you to take his offering. T pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom." This ancient incantation reverberated within the wall of spirituality, stirring up spiraling gales as they swept forth with the force of nature. It was the oldest sacrificial language created by human beyonders, and it contained many mysteries itself. However, it lacked sufficient protection for the user. Bearing with the pain that was akin to having knives slicing across his skin, Alger took out a small dark brown glass bottle from his pocket, unscrewed the lid, and poured out a lot of sesame-shaped granules. These granules swirled with a metallic luster and exuded an indescribable sense of beauty. Alger scattered these granules into the wind. Whoosh! The gale grew stronger, but was no longer tempestuous. It was dyed in two separate colors, silver and black. As they continued to collide and mix, the two differently colored winds were infused into the candle flame that symbolized the fool, burgeoning and tearing open an illusory, ordinary-sized door. Its surface was carved with the same symbol that Alger had drawn. At this moment, Klein witnessed the appearance of the hazy door behind his high-backed chair. He could feel the spirituality in the air that was rippling apart and stimulating the mysterious space. It seems to be working. Klein suddenly had a premonition and immediately spread out his spirituality, infusing it with upheavals and stimulation. Creak! Amidst the insubstantial sounds, the blurry door slowly opened. In the captain cabin, Alger suddenly saw the illusory door, formed out of wind and light, open. Behind it was deep darkness formed from an innumerable number of almost invisible shadows. They were lustrous splendors, encompassing massive amounts of knowledge. Situated above them was the thick gray fog, with the ancient palace overlooking the real world. Such a scene caused Alger to involuntarily tremble. It was a deep fear, an indescribable excitement. He hurriedly picked up the rainbow salamander's pituitary gland that he had long prepared. He held it with both hands, and with his head bowed, he raised the palm-sized object which was constantly changing in color and had a soft feel to the ridges to the illusory door. Alger's hands grew lighter under the sudden appearance and instant disappearance of a suction force. He lost the slight tingling sensation that the rainbow salamander's pituitary gland gave him. He didn't dare raise his head until he heard the deep voice of the fool echoing in his ears. "You did well." "It's my honor," Alger answered without any hesitation. He looked ahead again, only to see that the illusory door had disappeared. The gale had stopped, and the candle flames had returned to their original state. After the candles were extinguished according to the normal procedures, Alger sat down with a complicated expression and said to himself silently, "In the beginning, only people could be pulled into the world above the gray fog. After a while, responses could be made by listening to prayers. Now, sacrifices and bestowment can be performed, Mr. Fool is freeing himself from his predicament one step at a time, and bit by bit will he enter the real world." This guess or conclusion frightened and worried Alger, but he also felt a bit of delight. "At least I'm a member of the Tarot Club, one of the earliest members," he sighed. In the majestic palace above the gray fog, Klein was playing with the pituitary gland of the rainbow salamander. Various colors were reflected on his face as they constantly changed color. A slight tingling sensation came from his palm, and a strong sense of accomplishment filled his heart, causing him to reveal a genuine smile. In the future, the Tarot Club will become even more miraculous. After reflecting over the situation, Klein extended his spirituality and sent his will to the Crimson Star representing Miss Justice. After returning to her bedroom, Audrey was no longer able to sit quietly on the edge of the bed. She would restlessly flip through the books by her bed and from time to time scrutinize herself in the mirror with an unfocused gaze. She was looking forward to the completion of the hanged man's sacrificial ritual, but she was also afraid that the result would be a failure. Emperor Roselle had said that one must remain calm and collected when important matters arise. "Audrey, come on, take a deep breath, or perhaps I should go tease the dog." However, Susie can talk and think, so she's an entity with her own dignity. I can't just casually tease her. Audrey's mind wandered, her hand unconsciously wringing an ornate doll dressed in splendid clothing. After an unknown period of time, a thick gray fog suddenly appeared before her eyes, and in the depths of the fog there was a lofty chair. Sitting there, the fool said with a smile, "Miss Justice, the attempt was successful. Have you prepared the materials that contain spirituality?" "That's great." As expected of Mr. Fool, Audrey forgot the hanged man's role in this matter. She held back her excitement and said, "Yes, I always have such materials with me." Audrey had been the same even before she joined the Tarot Club, but back then, she didn't know which materials could be considered to contain spirituality. She had merely moved them from the family treasury, in accordance with the various essential oil formulas she had gathered. Klein nodded slightly and said, "When do you plan on holding the ritual?" "This is based on the premise that there are no Bayonders around you." As a Bayonder dog count, Audrey looked at the tightly shut door, feeling a small tug at her conscience. "T can do it now," Klein tersely acknowledged. "The ritual's process is the same as I described previously. All you need to do is change the prayer to, 'Your devoted servant prays for your attention. T pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom. T pray for you to give me strength.' In addition to this, use the dualism method." Audrey thought it over, fighting the urge to nod, and she began preparing for the ritual. When the illusory door opened, and a scene even more illusory than the starry sky appeared, Audrey felt intoxicated in both body and mind. This is the mysterious world I've always been pursuing. This is the kind of feeling I've always wanted. She praised Mr. Fool wholeheartedly. It's faith toward the goddess, but for the fool it's worship. Audrey silently explained herself in her mind. Soon after, she was stunned to see that there was something on the altar. It was a soft object with lustrous color and was filled with ridges. The rainbow salamander's pituitary gland. Audrey felt a surge of joy in her heart. Her eyes lit up as she had the urge to step forward and grab it. However, her customs of etiquette took hold of her, as she sincerely praised Mr. Fool once again. After finishing the ritual, she impatiently walked forward and carefully examined the Bayonder material 5 times. Our tarot club is at a higher level than all the other secret organizations. Audrey secretly felt smug. She then glanced warily at the door, as if afraid of Susie's sudden intrusion. She had to redouble her efforts and immediately concoct the potion to complete her advancement. A few minutes later, she held a bottle of liquid that contained constantly changing lusters that could shine to the bottom of everyone's hearts. She confidently drank the telepathous potion and successfully tied through the integration stage with the Bayonder characteristics, achieving an advancement. The view before her seemed to clear up significantly, with a great increase in other aspects. Audrey familiarly used cogitation to restrain the dissipating spirituality. After her sequence stabilized, she smiled and walked briskly to the door, letting in the golden retriever. He saw the obvious suspicion on Susie's face. "You took far longer than usual." Susie didn't hide her thoughts. Audrey sat down on an ottoman and dryly laughed before changing the subject. "Susie, tell me, how should I secretly inform Zio and Fours about a particular matter without revealing myself, yet get them interested?" Before she finished her sentence, Audrey had begun to seriously ponder over the mission Mr. Fool had assigned her. Then she looked at Susie, and Susie looked back at her. The human and dog both fell into deep thought at the same moment. After completing his goal, Klein returned to reality, slept for a little more than an hour before hurrying out the door. He spent £1 to buy a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, wigs, and a variety of mustaches that could be torn off and stuck on with adhesive. They were disguises he would need later. Before dinner, he made a trip to Eastborough, the most crowded area and the most unsafe part of the city. He rented a 1-bedroom house at the rent of 4 soldi, 3 pence a week. He paid 2 weeks' rent and a deposit, coming up to a total of 17 soldi. Only then did Klein complete all his early preparation. Eastborough also left a deep impression on him. Most of the streets here were the same as Tingen's Lower Street, but the area that shared the traits was many times larger. The clothes of the residents here were old but decent. Many of them were dressed in shabby clothes with sallow skin and thin frame. It was as though they would turn into beasts at any moment due to their hunger or poverty. Therefore, gangs ran rampant in Eastborough. When he got back to Sherwood Borough, Klein felt as if he had entered heaven from hell. For the next 2 days, he experimented with using his spirituality to perform the rituals and create charm. He no longer prayed to the goddess and waited for the effects of his tiny advertisements to bear fruit. On Thursday morning, Klein finally heard the doorbell ring. Ding, dong. A rope was being tugged. causing the doorbell and the sound it made to constantly tinkle and send its sound echoing throughout the spacious but relatively empty living room. Klein, who was seated on the sofa reading a newspaper to study the various investment opportunities, stood up. He was wearing a white shirt and a black vest without a bow tie, just like what one would wear at home. The first job in my career as a detective. But I can't always be at home, waiting for a mission to arrive. Yes, I need to hang a notice on the door, along with a fountain pen, so that clients can write down the time of their next visit and allow me to prepare in advance, however, for a new detective in this profession, without any fame. Doing so would basically be the same as not having a next time. Sigh, I can only go through the trouble of performing a divination in the morning to see if I would receive any jobs for the day. And if so, what time so as to make plans, of course. It's also possible that I would miss out on missions from powerful Bayund. Well, so be it. It might be a good thing after all. He walked to the door, and without looking through the peephole, the image of the visitors outside appeared in his mind. One of them was an old lady in a black plush hat. Her back was slightly hunched, and her face was deeply wrinkled. Her skin was shriveled and sallow, but her dark dress was very formal and neat. Her temples were completely white, but her blue eyes were quite lively. She was looking at the young man beside her, gesturing for him to pull the doorbell again. The young man was in his 20s, with eyes similar to those of the old lady. In the progressively cold weather, he wore a black double-breasted coat, a half-top hat, and a bow tie like he was about to attend a banquet. It was as if he wouldn't relax his demands of himself at any moment. With the help of a clown's premonition, Klein turned the handle, opened the door, and greeted his visitors with a smile before the bell could ring again. "Good morning, madam, sir. What a wonderful day it is, at least up to this point, for I have already seen the sun for 5 minutes." He spoke of the weather in a slightly exaggerated manner, small talk that had been popular in Backland for more than a century. Yes, it's always shy and doesn't come out from behind the fog in the dark cloud. The old lady nodded in agreement. By her side, the lad asked, "Are you Detective Sherlock Moriarty?" "Yes, and what may I help you with?" "I'm sorry, please come in. Let's sit down and talk." Klein turned his body to the side, making way for his guests as he pointed to the guest area. "No, there's no need. I don't want to waste any time. My poor Brody is still waiting for me to save it," the old lady said with a rather sharp voice. "T-T." Klein noticed the most important pronoun and suddenly had a bad feeling. The very formally dressed young man nodded and said, "Brody is a cat owned by my grandmother, Madame Doris. He went missing last night, and I hope you can help us find him. We live at the end of this street, and I'm willing to pay you 5 solely for it. Of course, if you can prove that you've spent more time and effort than that, I'll make it up to you. Find a cat. The reason why you're entrusting me with this job is simply because of the convenience stemming from how we live on the same street." Klein felt that this wasn't the detective career that he had imagined. "It makes me look like a clown. Well, I can't turn down my first business deal. This is a seer's point of view." He pondered for a few seconds and asked, "Can you describe it in detail?" Granny Doris spoke out before the young man could open his mouth. "Brody is a lovely, lively black cat. It's very healthy, has beautiful green eyes, and loves to eat cooked chicken breast. Goddess, last night, he ran off just like that. No, it must have gotten lost. I've placed lots of chicken breast in its bowl, but it refuses to return to take a look." Klein's lips curved up and said, "I'm very satisfied with your description, Mrs. Doris. Do you accept this request? All right, let's go to your home now. I need to search for clues and find traces. You should be clear that the basis of my reasoning lies in the detail." Mrs. Doris didn't consult her grandson as she nodded and said, "You're the most proactive detective I've ever seen." "It's a deal." Klein put on his coat and hat, picked up his cane, and followed Madame Doris and her grandson out onto the street. Unlike Tingen, roads in many parts of Backland had been rebuilt with cement or asphalt. Even during a downpour, the roads were less muddy. While the old lady was leading the way, his grandson came close to Klein and said in a low voice, "I hope you'll do your best to find Brody. It's been one of the pillars of my grandmother's life, ever since my grandfather and parents passed away. After Brody went missing, something went wrong with my grandmother's mind, so much so that she started hearing things. She keeps telling me that she hears poor Brody mewing miserably." Klein immediately nodded and said, "I'll do my best." "Right, I still haven't gotten your name." Jurgen Cooper, a senior solicitor," the young man replied. Soon they reached 58 Minsk Street and entered the dark house. This is Brody's bowl. This is his favorite box. He always sleeps here. Doris's wrinkled face was filled with worry and expectation. Klein squatted down and found several strands of black cat fur in the box. He straightened up and gripped his silver inlaid cane with the hand that held the cat's fur. Klein's gaze turned deep as he pretended to observe his surroundings, as he silently recited a divination sentence. His hand secretly slipped from the end of the cane, but didn't leave it completely. It just made it difficult for Jurgen or Doris to notice that the cane was standing on its own. Soon after, the black silver inlaid cane tilted to the side. It fell very slowly, with very little movement. Klein gripped the cane again, looked in that direction, and observed it for more than 10 seconds. Then he strode over to an old cupboard. Any signs of Brody running away? Jurgen asked with concern. The old lady, Doris, was also waiting for an answer. Without answering, Klein kneeled and pulled open the door at the bottom of the cupboard. Meow. A black cat darted out, tail high, and ran for its bowl. Brody, when did you get into the cupboard? How did you get locked in there? Mrs. Doris cried, surprised and confused. Jurgen turned his head in surprise and looked at Klein. How did you know it was in the cupboard? Klein smiled and replied in a deep voice, Inference, my good man. After obtaining the 5 solely reward from Mrs. Doris and Jurgen, as well as their friendship, Klein returned to 15 Minsk Street under the gloomy weather. Before he even got close, he saw a figure loitering in front of his door. More business. When Klein looked over, he saw that the visitor was a boy of 15 or 16, dressed in an old coat and a round hat that didn't fit his age. It's him. Klein immediately recognized him as the boy he had met on the steam train the day he had arrived in Backlund. Back then he was being pursued, but his maturity and calmness at the time had left quite a deep impression on Klein. What would he want to entrust me with? As he wondered, Klein walked over and smiled. Excuse me, are you looking for me? The teenage boy was startled as he quickly turned around, his bright red eyes filled with unconcealable fear. He composed himself and asked hesitantly, Are you Detective Sherlock Moriarty? Yes. Klein looked around and said, Let's talk inside. All right. The teenage boy didn't refuse. Inside, Klein didn't take off his coat, but he did take off his hat and put his cane away. He led the teenage boy to the guest area, pointed at the long sofa and said, Please have a seat. How might I address you? What job do you have for me? You can call me Ian. The teenage boy surveyed his surroundings and fell silent for a few seconds. I was previously hired by another detective, Mr. Zerial Victor Lee, who helped me gather some news and information. Klein sat down, clasped his hands and said, Does the job have anything to do with your former employer? Yes, Ian nodded solemnly. A few days ago I suddenly found myself being followed by someone with ill intentions, therefore I thought of a way to lose their tail. I believe you saw this scene yourself, Mr. Moriarty. I recognized you as the man who was sizing me up on the metro that day as soon as I saw you. This level of observational skills isn't any worse than a spectator's. Could it be that he was born with a special ability? Or is he a beyonder? Klein activated his spirit vision and looked at Ian, but he didn't find anything strange. He nodded and calmly replied, Your response left an impression on me. Ian didn't harp on the topic and continued, I suspect that my encounter has something to do with Mr. Zerial, so I went to visit him at his place. I found the place seemingly normal, but there were many hints that indicated that someone had infiltrated and triggered all the tiny mechanism. Haven't seen Mr. Zerial since that day. I suspect that something has happened to him. Tried to call the police, but his disappearance period has yet to reach the required number of days to make the request. I tried to get help from other detectives that I knew, but all of them turned me down, on the grounds that they had just met Mr. Zerial at a fellow detective's party. That surprised me because I didn't receive any response from Mr. Zerial when I contacted him using the agreed-upon method. He still stood by my judgment and intended to ask for the help of a detective whom Mr. Zerial doesn't know. Well, as such, that meant it would be someone I don't know either. I had no idea who to look for as well. Therefore, I could only search through the newspapers and ended up finding you, Mr. Sherlock Moriarty. Klein asked after listening carefully, So you suspect that the Zerial whom the detective saw was someone in disguise? Holding his brown round hat, Ian replied as if he had already thought about it. It's a possibility, but I think it's too difficult due to the huge risks involved. The party was at night, and it's true that the lights weren't very bright, but most of the people attending are detectives with keen observational skill. Just a wig, beard, or cosmetics can hardly hide from their eye. Perhaps some Beyonder powers can do it. Just like how creeping hunger enables such an ability, there was a little trap in Klein's question. He wished to determine from the teenage boy's answer, the expression on his face, and his body language to determine if he had ever come into contact with Beyonders, or if he knew things about mysticism. The initial answer was no. When Ian saw Detective Moriarty nodding slightly in agreement with his reasoning, he continued, I believe that the detective saw Mr. Zerial, but he wasn't free. He was in a controlled state in which he couldn't send out distress signal. The reason why he wasn't responding to my attempts to liaison with him is to probably signal to me that he needs help. A reasonable explanation. Klein released his clasped hands and sat back a little, making himself look more relaxed and confident. Ian fell silent for about 10 seconds before he said seriously, I'd like to entrust you with the task of investigating Mr. Zerial and determine his current condition. All I need is confirmation. Considering that Ian was a semi-professional who had gathered intelligence and information for a detective, Klein had the intention to make his acquaintance. He smiled and said, Then how much are you going to pay? You should be well aware that this may be very dangerous. Ian looked down at the pocket of his old coat and said after some deliberation, There are two ways. The first, I can directly give you a payment that's enough to satisfy you. Afterward, regardless of whether the mission is simple or difficult, that will be all unless you suffer a relatively serious injury. Secondly, I could pay you £5 in advance, and when you finish the job, you can add on to the bill depending on the difficulty of the matter. But it's easy to cause a dispute, even if there's a contract. Klein pretended to be in thought, and after almost 30 seconds, he said in a low voice, Why don't we do it this way? You can pay me £5 in advance, and help me with 3 things after the mission is completed. Don't worry, they won't be anything difficult. They will be within your capabilities, and it won't make you feel too uncomfortable. This can be agreed upon in the contract. Ian knitted his brows before standing up. He leaned forward and stretched out his right hand. All right. Klein shook hands with him, pulled out a standard contract that he had prepared, picked up a round fountain pen, added all the details he had discussed, and stamped it with his fingerprint. After signing the contract, he gave the teenage boy Ian a stack of white paper and watched him write Detective Zerial's relevant information. After a while, he browsed through the information and casually asked, How can I contact you if there's an emergency, or if I've confirmed Zerial's condition? Ian pursed his lips and remained silent for quite a while. Only when Klein looked over did he reply in a somewhat stiff manner, You don't need to contact me. I will appear at the right time. Without another word, he took out a thick stack of cash from the pocket of his old coat. They seemed to be stacked up in a very neat order, from high face value to low face value. Ian pulled out 3 one-pound notes from the bottom, counted 6 5-soldi notes, and finally 10 one-soldi notes. When Klein saw that Ian had neatly arranged the notes, with even the portraits of the former kings facing up without a single mistake, Klein suddenly felt a bit frustrated. This is some late-stage obsessive-compulsive disorder. He silently exhaled and received the payment from Ian. According to his visual estimate, Ian had less than £3 left. He probably had all his savings with him. If I had asked for more, would he bail on me without paying? He doesn't look like the kind of person to do so, but one shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Klein folded the bills at random and stuffed them into his pocket, ignoring the untidiness. As such, he succeeded in seeing Ian's slightly twisted expression. He'll try to complete the investigation as soon as possible. Klein stood up and held out his hand as a gesture of bidding him farewell. Thank you for your help. Ian thanked him sincerely, because the counteroffer was obviously a discount. Watching the boy who was more mature than his age leave, Klein stroked his chin and silently said to himself, This matter goes deeper than it seems. Ian didn't mention anything about Zerial's recent investigations or what information he had been instructed to gather. Forget it. I'll handle as much as the money is worth. All I need to do is confirm Zerial's current condition. He turned around and walked back into the living room. While doing so, he fished a quarter-pence out of his trouser pocket. Ping! As the copper coin tumbled in the air, Klein's eyes turned dark as he muttered if there were any Beyonder elements in the case he was handling. Then he opened his right hand and tried to catch the copper penny. Clang! The coin slipped from his fingertips and fell to the ground, rolling away. This result meant that the divination had failed. From the looks of it, Ian has withheld more things than I thought. The information is so lacking that I can't even obtain a vague divination result. He pursed his lips, took a few steps forward, and bent down to pick up the coin. That night in the wee hours of the morning, at 138 Rose Street, Backland Bridge, Klein had changed into a cheap light blue workman's outfit. His mouth, chin, and cheeks were covered with a black beard that, at first glance, made him look rough and savage. He wore a dark-colored cap and pressed it so low that it nearly covered his eye. Such caps originated from the Intis Republic hunter. There were certain differences from the traditional deer hunting caps the Lone Kingdom hunters wore. However, such caps had become popular among the lower-class populace of Backland. Hiding in the shadows of an Intis parasol tree by the side of the road, Klein studied the house across the street with the aid of the elegant gas lamps. It was Zeriel's home. The detective was from Southville. His parents, relatives, and friends were all there, and he had come to Backland alone, where he slowly forged a name for himself. He was still a bachelor, and had only hired 2 temporary maids, the kind that came by every 3 days to clean up the place, without needing to provide them with food or lodging. At the moment, the terrace house he rented was pitch dark. Klein took off the silver chain inside his sleeve and let the topaz pendant hang down naturally. "There's danger inside. There's danger inside." After repeating it 7 times, he opened his eyes and saw the spirit pendulum spinning clockwise, but very slowly. "There's danger, but it's nothing serious," Klein muttered, and once again confirmed that he had his tarot cards, self-made charms, and holy night powder on it. After doing all this, he looked around, and taking advantage of the stillness of the night, he nimbly rushed across the street. There was no veranda, garden, or lawn as it directly faced the edge of the street. Klein went around to the side and easily climbed up the water pipe to the small balcony on the 2nd floor where clothes could be hung out to dry. Immediately following that, he took out a tarot card and slid it through the crack, opening the door to the corridor. Following Ian's drawing of the house's layout, Klein walked almost soundlessly to Zeriel's bedroom. He lightly tapped his left molar and activated his spirit vision. Through the wooden door, he looked inside. Spirit vision could see aura colors through obstacle without spirituality. However, it was highly dependent on one's abilities. Currently, Klein was able to observe through wooden doors, but was stumped by concrete walls. Furthermore, the scenes he could see weren't too clear. In his vision, he saw 3 humanoid auras in the bedroom behind the door. The colors were blurry and were located in different locations. There are 3 people lying in ambush. Is it to capture Ian or someone else? The bedroom isn't that big. Klein stood in the darkness, calmly considering the results of his observation. At that moment, he suddenly retreated towards the balcony while keeping his footsteps very light. Back at the balcony, Klein took a thin silver slice from his pocket. This was a slumber charm that he had created in an attempt during the afternoon. He didn't pray to the Evernight goddess, but to himself instead. He held a ritual in the name of the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck, before entering the world above the gray fog to respond. Since this method was difficult to mobilize the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, Klein could only use his own spirituality to respond. The charms that he made in the end were worse than normal, but better than the ones he made in his own name. After surveying his surroundings again, Klein covered his mouth and whispered a word in ancient Hermit. "Crimson." Feeling the chill of the charm, he moved quickly but silently to the door of Zeriel's bedroom again. As he held the handle, he injected spirituality into the thin silver slice. Krieg. Klein carefully twisted the handle and opened a tiny crack in the door. Immediately after that, he threw the slumber charm inside. Pulling back his arm, Klein closed the door again and began counting. 3, 2, 1. He abruptly pushed open the door and rolled on the ground. Not sensing any movement from the 3 people, Klein stood up and, using the crimson moonlight shining through the window, began observing the room. It was a normal furnished bedroom with a bed, a row of closets, a desk, a set of sofas, and a coat rack. On the other side of the bed, a man in a black coat was sleeping soundly. In addition to that, there was one person by the side of the sofa and another in front of the closet. All of them were asleep. After confirming the trio's condition, Klein walked over to the bed and bent down to find a few short, yellowish-brown hair. According to what Ian had written, Detective Zerel was a man with short, yellowish-brown hair. "This should be right," Klein whispered. He grabbed the few strands of hair and sat down on the sofa. He slowly sat in the darkness tainted by the crimson light and planned on using dream divination to find Zeriel. Leaning back against the back of the sofa, the corner of his mouth curled up as he made a self-deprecating comment. "Deduction, my good man." "Detective." The dim room was covered in a thin veil of crimson moonlight, and everything was indistinct. The three men in the black coats were sleeping in different spots. And on the sofa, Klein's eyes half blended into the darkness by closing them. It was as if he had entered a deep slumber. His dream was a gray, distorted world, occasionally flashing with brilliance. Finally, the brilliance settled to form a scene. It was a gloomy corner, the ground sloshed with sewage. A man with short brown hair, a white shirt, and a brown vest was leaning against the wall, surrounded by a dense mischief of gray rats. Half of the man's lips had been bitten off, revealing his yellowish teeth and rotten gum. His nose was only stained with blood, mixed with some short hairs, and the flesh on his face had disappeared, piece by piece, revealing white bone. White, fat maggots were crawling around everywhere, constantly squirming, and his throat seemed to have been the victim of some wild beast. At least half of it was missing. Klein could just barely make out that this was Zeriel Victor Lee. It was nearly impossible to relate him to the mature and handsome man in the black and white photograph he had taken with Ian. Zeriel is already dead. In a few days, he would probably be gnawed to the point where he would only be bone. He might not even have a complete skeleton left. Klein left the dream and recalled what he had just seen. His past experiences had allowed him to witness similar corpses more calmly. Looking out of the window at the crimson moon, Klein thought for more than 10 seconds and decided to try communicating with the soul of the man in black next to the sofa. During the last few days of preparations, he had concocted a bottle of amantha extract, an eye of the spirit medication. As for Serenity Agent, Klein had no need for it. He was personally capable of invading the dreams of others and forcefully communicating with their souls while maintaining calm and rationale. After setting up a simple altar and letting the quiet and tranquil fragrance waft out to create a half-dreaming state, Klein prayed to himself, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." Following that, he entered the world above the gray fog and used more than 2/3 of his spirituality to give a response. When I advance to sequence 7, such prayers should also allow me to use a little of the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog, just like my summoning and bestowment rituals. Looking around, Klein made a rough judgment and quickly returned to the real world. He passed through what seemed like a starry sky and a chaotic storm of thoughts, entering the mental plane of the target. There he saw the man's illusory figure floating in midair. "Who sent you to Zeriel's home?" Klein looked at him and asked in a deep voice. The man replied in a daze, his illusory eyes vacant. "Marceau. Marceau sent me to wait for the boy named Ian." The light in his spiritual world changed, revealing a lean, capable-looking, dark-skinned man. He was none other than the leader of the group, who was chasing Ian on the steam train. As expected, it's him, Klein, who had exhausted so much of his spirituality in responding to the prayer, was beginning to feel exhausted. He hurriedly asked, "Who ordered Marceau?" "No idea. He's an executioner of our Z-Manger gang." "No one can order him other than the boss," the man said blankly. Z-Manger, the word warrior in the language of the Highlanders. Klein, a pseudo-historian but a true mysticism scholar, suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head, and his body involuntarily flew out of the storm of thoughts. Not long afterwards, he exited the mediumship and felt his head throbbing. He was in no hurry to leave. He methodically packed up the materials and the short yellowish-brown hair before opening the oriel window to let in the cold night wind to disperse the smell of the amantha extract, an eye of the spirit medication. While this happened, Klein returned to the balcony, locked the door from the inside, and wiped off all the places he had touched. When Zeriel's bedroom returned to its original state, he then held his hand to his chest and bowed towards the three men who were still sleeping soundly. Straightening his back, Klein put on his gloves and leaped, nimbly flipping out of the oriel window. He stood firmly, tiptoeing in the abnormally tight space. He raised the open window's vertical latch and used a tarot card to hold its bottom. With his clown abilities, he took in the details and adjusted the balance. After a few seconds, Klein slowly pulled back the tarot card, and the vertical latch suddenly stopped in place, and didn't fall further. Whoosh! First, he closed the unlatched half of the window, then he jumped over to the window with a latch. His right hand jerked inward, closing the other half of the window. The speed of the action was so quick that the latch didn't fall down until there was a vibration, accurately inserting itself into the matching hole. Clang! A sound that was difficult to eliminate rang out, like a strong wind slamming onto the surface of the glass. Klein knew that the three men in the bedroom were about to awaken. Without further ado, he jumped onto the street. For the current him, the height from the second floor wouldn't pose any danger. It was just that he couldn't maintain his silence when he landed, so he didn't make any obvious noises. Klein quickly left the vicinity, as well as Rose Street, but he didn't directly take a rental carriage back to Sherwood Borough's Minsk Street. He turned a few corners and headed to the neighboring East Borough. It was a cold night, and the wind sent a biting chill right into his bones. Klein shivered and decided that he would need an additional sweater for his future mission. He decided to buy charcoal on one of the following days and let the fireplace carry out its role. After an unknown period of time, he entered Backland's East Borough despite not having a map. He had completely relied on instinct. There were only a few gas lamps to be seen in the distance, and if it wasn't for the fact that the dark clouds hadn't covered the crimson moon, Klein believed that many parts of the road would be pitch black. As he was walking, he suddenly saw pairs of eyes appear in the deep darkness in front of him. They came stooping from a distance. They sauntered over from a vague distance away, in silence. Living corpses. Klein came to a sudden halt. He reached out for his Requiem charm and tarot cards, and he quickly activated his spirit vision. He saw the unhealthy and weak-colored auras, and saw the faces of the numerous figures. These were all living people, normal living people with numbed expressions, vacant eyes, and weak movements. There were both men and women. It's almost midnight. Why are they still walking on the streets? Confused, Klein warily leaned to one side, passing the group on the sidewalk, but soon he came across a second wave. A third wave, all of them had the same pain amidst numbness. He frowned slightly, and just as he was about to move forward to inquire, he suddenly heard a shout ahead. "Get up! All of you get up! You sons of bitches! The streets and parks aren't for people like you to sleep in." Klein was startled. Then the corresponding term poor law popped up in his mind, and he understood what was going on. He had experienced the same thing himself. Klein exhaled, picked up the pace, and headed for his one-bedroom house on Black Palm Street in the East Borough. There he slept for 2 hours. After recovering some of his spirituality, he went out again and broke a withered branch to serve as a dowsing rod. The location of Zeriel's corpse. The location of Zeriel's corpse. After repeated divinations, Klein walked for a long time with the help of the short yellowish-brown hair, until he arrived at a corner of East Borough where there was a sewer entrance. 12 years ago, after the Great Plague, the Lone Kingdom gradually built up an advanced sewer system in the capital and, in one fell swoop, surpassed Roselle's heritage of the Intis Republic. Moving the manhole cover out the way, Klein held his breath and climbed down the vertical metal stairs. Since his clothes weren't specially made, he was unable to bring too many items due of the lack of pockets. He hadn't brought Quelog's oil, which he had learned about from Fry. Klein felt especially regretful for not having brought the refreshing and odor-dispelling Quelog's oil. 10 seconds later, Klein's feet touched the sticky ground. The feeling of filth caused fine goosebumps to pop up over his arms and body. However, he could only endure it and continue walking forward, venturing deeper into the empty and quiet sewer. There was a fork in the road ahead, one which was relatively hidden. A thick, pungent smell wafted over from there. Klein turned around and walked to the end, where he saw a dense number of spirituality light dots and aura color. Without needing to use a candle, he activated his spirit vision and directly saw that in the dark corner there was a rotten corpse that had been bitten to pieces. This was the exact same scene he had seen in the dream divination. Squeak! The densely packed gray rats scampered in every direction, but there were also some who stayed where they were, unwilling to leave and part with their food. After confirming that it was Zeriel, Klein hesitated for a moment before quickly setting up a mediumship ritual. If there's nothing wrong with Ian's description, and Zeriel died only a few days ago, I should be able to get some rough information by channeling his spirit, he thought confidently. Whoosh! As the wind swirled and the wall of spirituality was set up, all the rats fled, and Klein proceeded with his ritual as he had done before. The cause of Zeriel's death. The cause of Zeriel's death. As he recited the words, Klein's eyes turned black. His pupils and the whites of his eyes disappeared. He quickly used cogitation to enter a dream. However, nothing appeared in that misty, illusory world. Klein opened his eyes, frowning slightly as he made his judgment. The channeling failed. Someone has dealt with Zeriel's spirit. A Beyonder was involved in this. The fact that someone was able to disguise as Zeriel, making the other detectives unable to see through him, also proves this point. After some deliberation, Klein came to a decision. It was to end this matter here and not get involved any further. Regardless, he had fulfilled the requirements of the job that he was entrusted with. Get Ian to call the police, he muttered as he put away the materials and removed the wall of spirituality. Guidance Klein backed up from the fork in the path, without touching Zeriel's corpse. Thump, thump, thump. Suddenly, a sound echoed in the distance through the empty sewer. Klein listened for a few seconds before decisively retreating towards the exit, down the dirty concrete road that ran along both sides of the sewage channel. There was no need to take risks in matters that didn't involve him. Klein closed the iron manhole cover after he climbed out of the sewers. After ensuring that the surrounding area looked normal, he returned to his rented room in the East Borough and changed out of his disguise. Then he put on his gold-rimmed glasses, walked to another street, took a rented carriage, and returned to Sherwood Borough in the silence and cold of 3 in the morning. However, he didn't return to Mince Street. Then Klein made another huge detour, and only after confirming that no one was following him did he enter his house. He slept till dawn and was woken up by the doorbell. He sat up immediately, put on his shirt, buttoned his vest, and hurried down to the first floor to open the door. And even before that, his premonition ability as a clown was already capable of naturally forming the image of the visitor in his mind. The visitor was wearing an old coat, a brown round hat, and a tattered satchel. He had bright red eyes, a delicate face, and a quiet temperament. It was none other than Ian, the teenage boy who had come to entrust him with a job yesterday. "Good morning, Detective Moriarty." Ian greeted him and looked around. "Any progress?" "Yeah, I'm only asking because I happened to pass by." Klein nodded seriously and said, "Yes." Ian seemed shocked as he didn't say a word for quite a while. After a while, he stammered in surprise. "Have you determined Mr. Zeriel's condition?" "Yes." Klein paused for a moment, then said seriously, "I found Zeriel's corpse." "Corpse?" Ian's pupils shrank as he repeated it in a low tone. He wasn't too surprised, as if he had already expected the worst possible outcome. Klein watched silently without interjecting. Sigh, Ian exhaled and warily surveyed his surroundings. "Your efficiency is amazing. Can you take me to see Mr. Zeriel's body?" "No problem. In fact, that's what I was planning to do." Klein then thought for a moment before saying, "I hope you won't mention me when you call the police. Just say that you found the corpse yourself. I believe you know how to make up a reason." Ian wasn't surprised. He knew that not every detective liked to deal with the police. In fact, except for the very famous detectives, who often gave advice to the police with mutual cooperation, the rest were discriminated against, ostracized, and even extorted from. This was the current situation of the Lone Kingdom. "All right," Ian readily agreed. Considering that they were entering the sewers, Klein changed into a set of clothes worn by the common working class, put on a deer hunting cap, and took a lantern with him. Both of them took the public carriage to the East Borough. They walked for half an hour to reach the remote sewer entrance under the watchful gazes, filled with numbness and malicious intent. "How did you find it?" Ian asked, half surprised and half curious, as he watched Klein lift the manhole cover and climb down. Klein focused on the area beneath him and answered casually. "Skillful training which includes many techniques in reasoning, investigation, tracking, and interrogation." Ian followed him into the sewers. He nodded without looking disgusted. "You seem to have received very professional training." Klein didn't answer him directly. He held the already lit lantern and led Ian to the fork in the path where they arrived at the gloomy corner. He narrowed his eyes as he approached. More of Zeriel's body was missing now when compared to the previous night. He was missing an arm and half of his ribs. "That's not something a rat can do," Klein muttered to himself and didn't inform Ian of this. With the help of the lantern's light, Ian was able to clearly see the corpse's appearance. He squatted down suddenly, vomited, and gradually vomited yellow-green bile. Klein took out the Quelog's oil he prepared, unscrewed the cap, and bent over to place the mouth close to Ian's nose. Ian's eyes lit up and he calmed down. Nearly 20 seconds later, he weakly whispered, "Thank you." He stood up slowly and examined the mutilated corpse a few more times. "I can confirm that this is Detective Zerel." "My condolences," Klein replied out of politeness. "I suggest you call the police." "Okay." Ian nodded indiscernibly as he followed Klein back to the surface. At that moment, Klein clapped his hands. "This is the end of my mission. As for what should be done after this, that is up to you." Ian fell silent for a few seconds. "I still owe you 3 matters." "You can tell me now." "Actually, I can only think of one at the moment," Klein answered frankly. "I want to know where I can get a gun and bullets without needing a full-class weapon permit." Ian spoke, almost without thinking. "Go to Braveheart's bar at Iron Gate Street in the Backland Bridge district. Find Kaspar's Kalinin. Tell him old geezer introduced you. All right, let's talk about the other 2 matters in the future. I have a feeling that we'll meet again." Klein deliberately nodded casually. Ian gave him a look but didn't say anything. The two split up and headed down different streets in the East Borough. The secluded spot once again regained its silence. After walking for a while, Klein suddenly turned around and retraced his steps. He then hid himself in a secluded corner, peeking at the entrance to the sewer. After waiting for 2 or 3 minutes, he saw Ian return silently as he looked around warily. Klein withdrew his gaze in a timely manner, leaned his back against the wall, and listened. He heard the scraping sound of the manhole cover being removed and heard someone climbing down. Carefully poking his head out, Klein discovered that Ian had re-entered the sewers. Was there a clue or something on Zeriel's body? Indeed, this matter goes deeper than it seems. He nodded thoughtfully. Having satisfied his curiosity, Klein decided to leave for real and planned to seek out Kaspar's 2 days later. At tea time, Viscount Glaint was in his home situated in Empress Borough. The door to the study was tightly shut, separating the 4 people inside from the participating guests in the salon outside. "ZO4s, this is the reward the 2 of you deserve." Dressed in a pale yellow lace dress, Audrey pushed a bulging envelope across the desk to the 2 ladies sitting opposite her. Zio wanted to say something polite, but her hand had reached for the envelope faster than her mouth. Feeling the weight of the money, she could only say sincerely, "Miss Audrey, thank you for your generosity. Your honesty makes you look even more beautiful." As she spoke, she untied the thin string around the envelope and saw the bills inside. It was uniform gray paper money with black stripes. The stack was thick and exuded a special smell of ink, one that left one feeling refreshed. £10. Zio took one note out and checked its face value. Beside her, Fours, who appeared lazy and unbothered by money, had also leaned over. "This is at least," observing the thickness, Zio tried to figure out how many notes there were. She couldn't help but exchange looks with Fours and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. This was obviously a lot more than they had imagined. Audrey smiled faintly and said, "A total of £800. Decide how you will split the money between the 2 of you. Team, very sorry that this matter had placed you in danger." £800, no, there's no need to apologize. Even if we had to do it again and knew of the possible consequences, I would still accept the request, even if it's divided evenly. With my savings, it's enough to buy the potion formula for Sheriff. Zio, who was slightly taller than 150 cm, stared blankly at the notes in the envelope, wishing she could pull them all out and count them over and over again. She believed that the generous and beautiful Miss Audrey wouldn't pay them any less, but what if she had made a mistake counting? Everyone makes mistakes at times. Zio raised her right hand, paused for a few seconds, then silently lowered. The corners of Forrest's lips couldn't help but rise as she said wistfully, "This is even more than the royalties V received from my Stormwind Mountain villa so far. Should I praise Miss Audrey or laugh at the poverty of an author?" She added silently. Viscount Glaint, who was sitting on the sofa, was also a little envious, but it wasn't directed at Zio or Four. As a viscount with a fairly good financial situation, £800 wasn't a large sum. What he envied was Audrey's ability to hand out money without feeling the slightest burden. "Ahem," Viscount Glaint cleared his throat. "If you can get the formula for apothecary, I will also provide you with substantial payment." "We'll do our best," Zio answered without any hesitation. Then she looked at Audrey. "We've recently come into contact with someone who's suspected to be from the psychology alchemists, and will soon have clues regarding the spectator potion you're looking for. Zio, I'm already at sequence 8, far stronger than you. Audrey smiled in a reserved manner as she said, I'm looking forward to it. With that said, the four began chatting about various rumors among the Beyonder circles, while following Audrey's example of finding books they wished to read. Suddenly, Zio's eyes lit up as she saw two hardcover books, History of the Lone Kingdom's Aristocracy, and Study of the Coat of Arms. Meanwhile, Fours also found books that interested her. Geography and People of the Fasek Empire, and Traveling the Northern Continent. Honorable Viscount Glaint, may I borrow these two books? I'll return them soon. Zio looked pleadingly at the owner of the study. Glaint nodded without much care. No problem. At his response, Fours hurriedly made a request as well and similarly obtained his approval. The corners of Audrey's mouth curved into a faint smile as she witnessed all of this. She looked modestly to the side, pretending to be looking for a book. As a qualified spectator who had just advanced, she had accurately grasped Zio's and Fours' preferences in certain domains after being in contact with them multiple times. Thus, she had made arrangements in advance without anyone realizing. Letting the one being guided feel like it was done out of their own will was a manifestation of the powers of a spectator. In the evening, Zio was curled up on the sofa in front of the fireplace, reading History of the Lone Kingdom's Aristocracy under the gas lamp's illumination. Fours had gone for a gathering meant for authors. After reading for quite a while, Zio suddenly felt something strange about the hardback cover, so she carefully examined it and found an interlayer where an ancient piece of paper was hidden inside. The front side of the paper was covered with the special symbols created by Emperor Roselle, and on the back was a paragraph written in ancient Hermit. Viscount Glaint's ancestor deciphered some of Emperor Roselle's special symbols. Zio was suddenly excited. She struggled to decipher the ancient Hermes as she muttered silently, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck.